So glad you can make it. So take a seat, get comfy, because we're about to get started. So I have a little fun trick here, is that this is a magic book. It's also my page turner, quite literally in fact. So who exactly am I? Well, quite simply, my name is Brandon. I work at Square. I do a lot of things with Ruby, but that's not quite why we're here today. We're here to hear a story, and a particularly magical story at that. So, shall we get started? Starting with part 0, a very well-worn robe. Our journey today begins with the young lemur Red. You see, he's been out and about so much over the past 4 years, his robes have absolutely gone to tatters. And that, dear audience, is where our story begins. You see, Red is visited by his teachers, Professor Scarlet and Crimson, who are preparing for his graduation to be a senior lemur.
Ah, Red, there you are. I see you've finally taken after me. I'm so proud of you. Well, maybe we need to do something about that hat first. Maybe a wide brim instead, and they're not that bad, Professor. They're in perfectly good shape.
No, I fear those robes have seen better days. We'll have to see about finding something a bit more appropriate than your apprentice robes for your graduation.
But they're broken in. They're awesome. Why in the world would you change that?
Scarlet began to eye Crimson and starts to open her mouth to criticize him before the door flies open. A mysterious figure in what appears to be a cat with sunglasses, enter the room. Oh, no.
Oh, how delightful, Indigo and Escher Cat. Yes. Now stop right there. This won't do. No. You're a senior lemur now, Red. We need to commemorate this most momentous of occasion. You see, myself and Escher Cat have a bit of a proposition, a lovely adventure, if you will. Doesn't that sound like fun?
Now, by this point, Red and Scarlet look skeptical while Crimson is in the corner clapping to himself, quite amused.
What you need is a visit to Lavenville Robe, where the most stylish of all lemurs around the world gather. Suits, scarves, boots, hats, they have it all and so much more that you could even begin to imagine. I know, I've tried, it gave me a headache. Wait, what? Come, it's my turn. We get to take you on an adventure this time. I had to pay the author good money to get written into the story, and I won't have you dawdling and ruining it.
And with that, Indigo and Escher had taken young Red on a magical adventure to Lavenville Robe.
I mean, they're positively delightful, but how in the world do they keep getting in? Haven't you warded the castle by now?
For the life of me, Crimson, I haven't a clue. Not the slightest.
Ah, well, tea then?
Oh, yes, lovely. I do believe a jasmine today. Yes, that'll do nicely. The journey to Lavenville. We find our group of adventuring lemurs deep in the forest on the way to Lavenville. Well, we certainly hope so.
Do you even know where we're going, Professor Indigo? Well, if you cross the T and swing past the half moon to the gumdrop. Ooh, yes, that's why I left it. Give me that map. I need to find out where we are. I think we're lost.
Are you sure? I can barely read this thing. It seems like a pretty bad idea.
Wait, this isn't a map. No, what have you gotten us into? We're lost. An adventure by the sounds of it. Just look at all the fun we're having already. Oh, this was so worth it.
As Red and Indigo continue arguing about directions, the Escher Cat is getting more and more annoyed with the situation, is becoming quite vexed with our lemur friends. Now you see, the Escher Cat is a magical cat, and a very impatient one with that. Why, with a snap of its paw...
Ah, snap it is. I suggest you hold your breath, Red.
Now, as Escher Cat snaps, all space and time and reality begin to unfold around our group of merry lemurs, pulling them deeper into the void.
Oh, I love this ride. This is the best day ever.
Now, as I said, impatient magical cat, very convenient plot device. Now, the question is, where exactly are they headed now? So with that, we find ourselves overlooking the mountain town of Lavenville, where the sky up in the mountains has begun to shimmer. And out of the void, we see that Red has reappeared conveniently on a path directly to the city. But what of the other two?
Now, did you have to put me on the side of the cliff? You could have put me next to Red. That was mighty unkind of you.
And with that, our merry band of lemurs continues on to Lavenville. Part 2, Lavenville. And so they entered Lavenville and found themselves in the main way of Lavenville Row, home of many a fashionable lemur that shared their crafts. It would be no exaggeration to say much of lemur fashion happened to be born on these streets. And so Red wandered, awestruck, glancing at each store in turn, taking in the wonders of this place. It's overwhelming, quite frankly. Indigo waltzed on ahead, pointing out stores, sometimes getting a look of pure delight, other times a look Red couldn't entirely place and assumed was not quite so kind.
Come, come, so much to see, so little time. We'll be needing a new scarf, some boots, maybe 2 boots, a robe, maybe definitely three hats, wide brim, lettering, maybe,
Oh, yes, a suit. That's exactly what you need. So Red hurried and tried to keep up, but Indigo became lost in his own monologues, getting further and further away, muttering to himself all the while with Escher Cat in tow. And then Red stopped a moment to catch his breath when something quite unexpected happened. A scarf appeared out of the doorway, flying into his hands, and when he grabbed it, he found himself yanked into his shop as Indigo and Escher continued on their merry ways. Red found himself in front of a particular store, holding this scarf where a lemur he'd not seen in quite some time emerged from the doorway, pleading with him. Come quickly, before he notices, or you'll never find what you seek here." Red was confused by this, but given Indigo's enthusiasm and Saffron's pleading, he entered quite quickly. And just as Red entered, Saffron shut the door behind them very quietly so as not to catch attention. And on the door, there was a sign banning Indigo and a certain quantumly entangled feline from entry, but that's a story for another day. Speaking of which, where did those two end up?
Oh my, someone's singing my praises. Yes, I can feel it. What do you say to that, Red? Red?
Indigo glanced down to Escher Cat. Did you happen to... No, I thought not. Strange.
Ah, well, he'll turn up sometime later. That's the way these things work, right?
Might I interest you in some tea?
No, I feel like you're distracting me, and it won't work.
Is that a pearl oolong you have there?
Why, yes, indeed. Only the best. Would you care to join me for a cup?
And with that, Indigo and Escher were quite distracted indeed for the remainder of the talk. Part 3, a peculiar set of tailors. Red found himself inside the Vermilion Tailors, where a familiar lemur, Saffron, greeted him. Oh, it has been a while, perhaps 4 years even since we last seen each other. What fortune it is to find you. With that, Vermilion presented themselves with a flourish. 4 years. I do hope Cerulean is doing well, but that's not why you're here today. No, I think not. Yes, those robes. They're certainly the same well-worn and loved pair that you've been wearing all this time. But you wouldn't be here unless you intended to change that. Shall we give you a measure? From the nooks and crannies of room, measuring tape flew out, as if dancing along with Saffron's conducting, sizing Red up as they went. Yes, this will do nicely, I think, but these robes, they bear no magic. Such a tragedy. Have they not been decorated? Indeed, it seems to be the case. Perhaps Scarlet thought it was too early for Red. Red was confused by this. Magic? What do you mean magic? Are clothes not just clothes? At that question, Saffron looked directly at Red with Vermilion in tow. Ah, you see, clothing here can do far more than just dress. There are magics of all forms of decoration. Decoration that can apply to your coat and all manner of things. Red was fascinated by this and asked, can one learn such magic? Saffron smiled and replied, I think it no coincidence you come here to buy our shop today, young one. Arts of simple method decoration, method added, and even those prepending methods. Wonders of Ruby, and one we spent many a year teaching and practicing. No coincidence indeed, and a fortuitous encounter. Yes, such exciting times and such curiosity. Curiosity that must be rewarded. Oh, how fun! With that, Red resolved to learn all he could from these mysterious tailors. Simple method decoration. We shall start with arts of simple methods and how they relate to methods. Did you know that clothing speaks when it's created? And once it's spoken, we can add magics by listening to the true name of what we wear. Consider this boot that's given a magic remembering where it has traveled, or perhaps how long it's been used. There's great power with names in Ruby, and that we may bind magics to those powers. So let's say that we have a method that's very slow and expensive. If we were to call it more than once, it would be rather inefficient, no? So let's take a look at this method as a hypothetical example. How would we make sure it's not called more than once? Well, there are a few ways, but we'll be focusing on using an instance variable to remember the previous calls. If that instance variable is defined, we set a cache to remember it and we return it later. If not, we set that instance variable. Now, what if I told you there are ways to use such magics without writing such a cache on every single method that requires one? And that, my dear audience, would be decoration. To start with, we'll need to know a few things about what happens when a method is defined and what that happens return. Because methods, like let's say expensive method, did you know what happens when you happen to define that method? The name of the method happens to be returned, see for yourself. And it's a symbol of that name, which can be very useful. So where does decoration come in? Well, have you perhaps heard of the private keyword? So taking a look at private, all methods after this happen to be private, whether one or several. But did you know there's another way to use it? We can prefix a single method we'd like to be private, and that doesn't apply to any other methods in the class. And personally, I prefer for how explicit it is. So how exactly would private work? That's going to become very relevant to how this happens, with methods taking methods, or more specifically, the names of those methods. So let's take a look back at our expensive method, and remember that it returns that name. What if we added a method before the def that took that name and did something with it, much like private? Like let's say we happen to call it cache. Now, how exactly will we go from that method name to implementing that cache? We'll want to know about the instance method, which works with instance methods on a class. So to take a look at this, it takes the name of an instance method from a class as a symbol. The class Lemur happens to have an instance method, expensive method. It gives us back an unbound method. Now, you might wonder, what in the world is an unbound method and why does this matter? Well, an instance method needs an instance to run, and since we've separated it from the instance, we need to give it an instance to do something with. So that's why we have bind to give it one, which binds it to a new instance of Lemur. Now this gives us back a method object which works a lot like a proc or a function, meaning we can call it. And this gives us back the normal results that you might expect. Now you might wonder, why in the world would you do this instead of just calling the method? But bear with me for a moment. So we can store a reference to the unbound method as, say, original method as a name, and then we can do something with it later by using define method, which lets us define a method, or in this case, replace it. So looking at this, we might have a module to hold that, which we call cacheable. Now, it's lovely we have a reference to the original unbound method in here, but what exactly do we do with it? We use define method to overwrite the original method while keeping a reference to the old one in original method. And then we use the instance variable caching that you've seen earlier to store the results from that. And with that, what we would do is we would create an instance variable that happens to be named after that method, and then convert that to a symbol. Once we have that, we can check if it happens to be defined. If it is, we have a cache value we can return. You might wonder why not or equals. Well, if that method happens to return false or nil and that's a legitimate return, you might rerun it for no good reason, and that does tend to be a problem. Now let's zoom in on that define method. If the cache is not already populated, we want to call the original method like it would have been before. And then to call that method like it originally would have been, we need to rebind it to self, which is the instance of the class we're currently in. Now, original method happens to be that unbound method that we've seen before. Bind self binds to the instance that's calling this. And then call happens to call it with the arguments it normally would have been called with before it got wrapped in define method. And then to wrap that all up, we use instance variable set, which will both set that variable as well as return the value. Now, how exactly would we add that to the class? Why, with using extending. So to take a look at this, let's say that we went back to the Lemur class and take a look back at our previous method from earlier. Using cacheable, we can extend our class. Extend adds methods to the singleton class of Lemur, which means more or less we can do this, like you might have add a reader, add a writer, private, or other things. Well, not private is a keyword, but beside the point. Now, if we want to test that, let's get a helper method real quick with time that happens to return a value as well as how long it took that value to be processed. Now, let's start with a Lemur. And then if we happen to call expensive method a few times, what do you think it might return? Well, you'll notice that cache is quite a bit faster. That second argument goes from about 0.02 of a second down to about 3,200 times faster. So that does definitely make a difference. So we may decorate a pair of boots with a single magic or multiple. You can see how many magics like this might be useful to a practicing magician. Yes, indeed. And with that, Red put on the boots, wondering what magics might apply in the future. Method added decoration. Now that last magic was lovely, but wouldn't it be difficult to keep adding prefixes to a method? What if you needed to add arguments to control how that magic happened to work? If you were to try and combine multiple decorations, that would be very hard and very awkward. There are magics that can work around this by waiting until you put a particular piece of clothing on before activating rather than enhancing it directly. Now let's remember back to private for now. So looking at that, we happen to have the prefix, which I mentioned earlier, but we learned how that one worked. What about the other one? Because this applies to one method, or it applies to several methods. And how does that work? Well, let's start off by becoming a bit more affable, shall we say. So looking at that, let's say we had a module called Affable, which provides us with an ever so lovely greeting for lemurs everywhere. We could create a lemur class that happens to extend Affable and give it an extra little touch. Like let's say that for the greeting right below there, we want to add an extra affable to say something like, lovely to see you afterwards. So how exactly would we do that? Well, to start with, remember private? How exactly does it know every method after it are the ones that you should work with? Well, taking a look at these three methods, they're after the private keyword, but how do you know that this isn't applying to everything above private as well? That's a bit of a conundrum, isn't it? How does it keep track? Well, with a flag. That way we know when decorating method has been called, and then how exactly might we use that flag? This flag is used to say everything after this point should be extra affable or private in that case. Why with method added? And this is a very interesting thing of Ruby, which every time a method is added or defined in a class, it calls this hook. So to take a look at that, it's a class method that captures the name of every method added, and that does mean every method, which can be very dangerous. Given that, how do we limit it? By using the flag that we happen to have before. In the case that we only wanted to use one method, we want to turn that flag off right afterwards. In the case we want everything after it, we leave that flag on. If we want this to behave like a private keyword, we want to use the second case. From there on, we're back to our original idea of method wrapping. So to take a look at this, we add method added to the affable module. And we want to return unless we happen to want that to be extra affable, handling our flag. And then afterwards, we want to capture the original instance method, again an unbound method for later, define that method to overwrite the original, and then clean that up for a moment just so we have a little bit of a closer look. The first thing we do in our new method is to get the original result by rebinding itself, much like we've done before with the regular arguments. And then we want to add an extra affable little suffix to any sentence that happens to be called with this. The only question remaining is whether it works like we intended to. Should we give it a try? So to take a look at this, we extend affable in the class and then see if that happens to work. Now, our greeting here might be a little bit extra affable. Like if we call this, we would now have, hello there, lovely to see you. So as you can see, all types of magic can be attached to clothing and only apply when it's included in your wardrobe. And that can apply to a great many things. Prepending decoration. What if one went one step further and added an ability to add magics to a piece of clothing that applies before all other magics, including and especially the ones you yourself might not own? But before that, we need to get into prepend and what is it and why is it different from extend and include? We'll keep these examples high level for now. Do note, if you do try such things in IRB, if you prepend something, it cannot be included. If you include something, it cannot be prepended, so make sure to start over your session. Now then, included. So included does this to the call chain in that the inclusion happens after the instance of the class it was included to. So the instance of the class will be called first, and then whatever happened to be included will happen afterwards. If we were to try this with affable, we'd find the following ancestry, where affable is after lemur in the call chain, and then the rest of the call chain continues, which we will not get into for now. Now extend is a little bit different. Extend will add behavior to the class rather than to the instance of a class, or more specifically to the singleton class. So if we were to instead extend affable, ignoring for a moment that it won't do much, that call chain might look like this, that we have the singleton class of lemur, and then affable, and then the rest of the call chain, much like it would have happened before. Now, we won't get into singleton classes here, except to mention that they exist. And that leaves us with Prepend. What happens to be different about that? It works much like include in that it includes behavior in the instance of class, but instead of including after, it includes before, which unlocks a very interesting amount of power. So if we took a look at our lemur class again, and be sure you haven't already included the same module or it won't work, we can see what Prepend does in this chain. Affable will appear before lemur, meaning that our module will be hit first. Why? Well, when using include, we rely on the class including the module to call it. With Prepend, we come first. We set the rules and we decide whether or not we even want to call the original class or whether we want to intercept the entire thing. And this is especially useful for things we don't happen to own and might need to debug, like say database drivers or other gems. So let's demonstrate what we mean by that. So say we had a talkable module and a lemur class is prepended to it with its own talk method. If we called that, what do you think might happen here? Take a moment and consider that. Now, for the most part with include, this would have returned, I wasn't expecting you today. But in the case of prepending instead, that's going to happen to return hi there, which is coming from our prepended module, which completely ignores the original method on the instance of the class, unless we were to call super to call the original, like so. In which case, it'll say hi there, I wasn't expecting you today. Now, let's get into another thing we're going to need to make this work, which would be modules that we create dynamically. So to take a look at that, you can create a module using module name, but you could also use module.new. Now, why would you want to use this and why is this useful? We'll get into that in a moment, but bear with me for a moment. Now, let's say we had a few phrases for an example, a hello and a goodbye, and we want to convert those into methods. We can use module eval to eval inside the context of this class, or rather execute code inside of there. And this is the same as class eval if you have seen that method as well. Now, inside of here, we might iterate all the phrases just to see what happens with that. And then we can define a method based on that name that returns the phrase. Now remember, inside this block, it's evaluated in the context of the module, so define method will add a method to that module. And we can even check this right afterwards and ask, what are the instance methods of this module? And we defined hello and goodbye. Now, one more thing before we get into how this works with prepending, and that's working with the dynamic constants. So to take a look at this, we might have something like timeable, and you'd recognize the normal way to define a constant here of all caps, and let's say text being something. If we were to look at this, we'd see that we can access the constant using double colon or by using dot constants. But what if a dynamic constant were added? We can use const set, and as we've seen with instance variable methods, there's a set, there's also a get, which allows us to get hold of that. And if we were to check our constants, we'd see that C2 happens to be in there as well, and that'll become very useful here in a moment. Now, the problem with using class methods to dynamically prepend modules is we need aspects of both extending and prepending to make it work. Now, how would we do that? Why, with more module hooks like method added. So let's take a look back at timeable. Now, the timeable module actually has 3 methods like this: included, extended, and prepended, which allows us to access any class which happens to include, extend, or prepend our module, which can be very useful. In this case, we only need to care about extend. So let's take a look at prepending versus extend. So to take a look at this, we have our extend method, and we have our class inside of here. We would start by dynamically creating a module we intend to prepend methods to. And then we prepend that module in front of the class which extends this module, meaning any method on the timing module will be called before the class happens to be called. And finally, we set that constant to our class to ensure we have a reference to get at it later. So what happens once we extend this module in class? Well, let's try. Say we have a new lemur class and we extend timeable. If we have to look at the constants, we'd see that timing is attached, and eventually it'll have our prepended methods on it. So let's get to prepending at last here. So remembering back, we have our module extending a given class and setting a module on it in a constant and adding prepend methods to. Question is, how do we prepend those methods? Well, going back to our timeable module, we might have a method like measure, which works very similar to symbol method decoration, the cache method from before, but works a little bit differently. We want to use the self-timing and module eval in the concept of that. And then we could do self : timing, or we could do const get timing. Personally, I like this, it's prettier. And inside that module eval is where things start looking very familiar to everything we've done, except we're not overriding the method, we're defining a new one on that new prepended module. Now notice we don't have an instance method call here, but there's something else interesting. Do you happen to see it? By using Prepend, we can call super instead of having to capture the method because super refers to the original method, giving us the ability to do whatever we want with it. In this case, we want to know how long that happened to take, and then log that to standard out before returning the normal result afterwards. And altogether, that might look a little bit like this. So now that we have a measure of how it's used and what effects, how does that work with our lemur class? Well, let's take a look back at our measure code here, but let's focus on the lemur class, which extends it. And going back to that, and then scoping out one more time, we'll first extend timeable, and then we'll add a method, which we have to do measure def expensive method again. And this, of course, is just a quick example. Now, if we were to run this a few times, we can see that that's going to log to standard out. The first took about 0.02 seconds, and the second used some scientific notation I cannot read. But what about the lemur class? What happened to it? Well, let's take a look. So inside of here, we can see that the timing constant is still there. And second is that the constant should have an instance method called expensive method, the same one as we happen to overwrite. But what's interesting is that the third is we can check to see that the lemur class acknowledges that lemur timing is the owner of the expensive method, currently not lemur itself anymore, which is very interesting as how Prepend works. And lastly, just to show that chain again, lemur timing is indeed in head of the lemur class. Why is this useful? Because stack traces will indicate their prepended module is where methods are going, rather than hunting down where something happened to be monkey patched or modified in a crude or unusual way. So why not use method added here, like we did with this second example? Well, because you only have so much time today before Indigo gets bored and barges in, so we'll have to leave that as an exercise for you to try and implement later. This magic in particular has a lot of use, especially for debugging and more safely manipulating code that you do not own. In the days of old, there was another art of alias method chain that was used, but Prepend replaced it. Many choose to think of it as a preprocessor for code. And with that, Red tried on the Robe and resolved to validate any magics using Prepend and think of other uses in the future. Which brings us to our farewells. And with that, it was time to say farewell. Well, thank you so much for your time, but I have to ask, how did you keep Indigo busy this entire time? He's quite set on touring the city. We're not entirely sure, to be honest. This has never happened before.
Oh, delightful, Sir Lavender. Another.
You know, sharing tea with strangers is one of life's true delights, my friend.
Before you go, young one, take this hat as a final parting gift. I think it will tie together your outfit quite nicely. Yes, special order. I think it'll tie things quite nicely together indeed. And with that, Red began his journey home, thanking the mysterious Tailors. The journey home. So another tale was told, and Red sat at his desk recounting his experiences and all that he had learned. Of course, Indigo and Escher Cat never returned that day, nor for several days afterwards, and the castle was very quiet. Of course, they were absolutely fine, but that's another story.
You know, I should host a tea party. Maybe I could even tie into those monad things everyone's talking about.
A very unfortunately long story. For you see, in the world of the lemurs, there are many lessons to be learned, friends to be made, people to meet, and experiences to have. That was one lesson Red always found himself coming back to, even after all this time, and as he would grow older and wiser himself. In the end, it was the community he'd been a part of that made it so beautiful and so special to him. So to wrap everything up, this talk has been a completely custom work with all original artwork, taking about 140 hours to prepare, about 256 slides, and as always, my slides are available upon request. If you want more work or to contact me at all, feel free to reach out at any of these social networks, and I will respond as soon as I can. And as always, before we finish today, I'd like to take a moment to thank the community, because talks like this would not exist with all of my friends that have been there to support me, work with me, and watch early versions of this talk, said a kind word, or even thank you. But I do want to note that community is a very fragile thing. We have to be very careful to foster it and not let people drag each other down, as I've seen in the past. So be very careful with your community, foster friendships and love, and let's make Ruby a beautiful thing together. Thank you so much.